In the year 412 BCE, the city-state of Athens maintained its position as the intellectual center of the Greek world, though the prolonged conflict with Sparta had begun to strain its resources and test the resolve of its citizens. The Peloponnesian War, now in its 19th year, had transformed the political and social landscape of the Hellenic world, yet within the city walls, philosophical discourse continued to flourish in gymnasiums, marketplaces, and the porticos where teachers gathered students. The traditional institutions of Greek education remained intact, with wealthy families employing tutors to instruct their sons in rhetoric, mathematics, and the works of Homer, while public spaces served as informal academies where ideas about virtue, justice, and the proper conduct of life were debated with the same intensity that military strategies were discussed in the assembly. The philosophical landscape of Athens in this period reflected a diversity of approaches to understanding human existence and the pursuit of the good life. The legacy of Socrates, who had questioned his fellow citizens in the agora for decades, continued to shape intellectual discourse, though his method of persistent inquiry had earned him as many enemies as admirers. His student Plato had begun to establish his own school of thought, developing elaborate theories about the nature of reality and knowledge that would be formalized in the academy he would found several years later. The sophists, itinerant teachers who offered instruction in rhetoric and persuasion for a fee, maintained their influence among ambitious young men seeking success in public life, despite the skepticism their relativistic teachings generated among those who believed in absolute standards of truth and morality. The social structure of Greek city-states rested upon well-defined hierarchies and expectations that governed nearly every aspect of daily life. Citizenship carried specific privileges and responsibilities limited to free adult males of legitimate birth, who participated in the governance of the polis through assembly votes and jury service. The household served as the basic economic unit, with the male head exercising authority over wives, children, slaves, and property. Public life and private life maintained distinct boundaries, with political participation and philosophical discussion taking place in designated public spaces, while domestic matters remained largely hidden from view. The accumulation of property, the maintenance of one's reputation, and the fulfillment of civic duties formed the essential components of a respectable life for those fortunate enough to possess citizenship. Religious observance permeated Greek society through festivals, sacrifices, and the consultation of oracles, providing a framework for understanding divine will and securing favor from the gods who were believed to intervene in human affairs. The temples dotting the landscape served not only as places of worship, but as repositories of wealth and centers of civic pride. Mystery cults offered initiates the promise of special knowledge and favorable treatment in the afterlife, while traditional household worship honored ancestors and protective deities. The integration of religious practice with civic identity meant that participation in festivals and sacrifices functioned as an expression of belonging to the community rather than solely as a matter of personal belief. Into this world of established customs and traditional values, certain individuals would eventually emerge who questioned the fundamental assumptions underlying Greek civilization. The philosophical movements that would challenge conventional thinking about wealth, status, and social obligation were beginning to take shape in the decades following the death of Socrates. Antisthenes, who had been among Socrates' followers, had started to develop ideas that would diverge sharply from the idealistic philosophy of Plato, emphasizing instead the importance of living in accordance with nature and rejecting the artificial distinctions of wealth and social rank that structured Greek society. His teachings attracted those who found in his austere approach to philosophy a more direct path to virtue than the elaborate theoretical systems being constructed by other schools of thought. The northern coast of the Black Sea, far from the intellectual ferment of Athens, supported numerous Greek colonial settlements that maintained commercial and cultural ties to the motherland while developing their own distinct identities. These colonies served as trading posts where Greek merchants exchanged manufactured goods for grain, fish, and other products from the surrounding territories. The city of Sinope, situated on a peninsula that provided natural harbors and defensive advantages, had prospered as a commercial center for several centuries. Its citizens enjoyed the benefits of trade while maintaining the institutions and customs of Greek civilization, building temples, theaters, and gymnasiums that marked their connection to the broader Hellenic world. Diogenes was born in Sinope around the year 412 BCE, the son of Hycesius, a banker who held a position of some importance in the city's financial affairs. The family belonged to the propertied class, enjoying the comforts and security that came with wealth and respectable social standing. As the son of a prominent citizen, Diogenes would have been expected to receive an education befitting his station, learning to read and write, studying the poets, and developing the skills necessary to manage property and participate in civic life. The trajectory of his early years appeared to follow the conventional path of a young man from a prosperous family, with the assumption that he would eventually assume responsibilities in the family business and take his place among the city's leading citizens. The operations of a banking establishment in a Greek colonial city involved the handling of deposits, the exchange of currencies, and the extension of credit to merchants engaged in trade. Hycesius would have maintained relationships with ship owners, grain dealers, and other commercial operators, facilitating transactions that kept goods moving between the Black Sea region and the markets of the Greek world. The physical coins that passed through such an operation bore the stamps of various city-states, each guaranteeing the weight and purity of the silver or gold they contained. The integrity of these stamps mattered enormously to merchants who relied on them to conduct business across distances too great for personal verification of every transaction. The details of what transpired in Sinope during Diogenes' youth remain obscure, filtered through layers of later accounts that often served purposes other than historical accuracy. What can be established with some degree of confidence is that Hycesius became involved in a scandal concerning the defacement or adulteration of the city's coinage. Whether he acted alone or in concert with others, including his son, and whether the offense involved deliberate fraud or resulted from some misunderstanding of proper procedure, the sources do not permit certain conclusions. The consequence, however, appears beyond dispute. Both father and son fell under suspicion, and Diogenes found it necessary or prudent to leave Sinope. The experience of exile, common enough in the Greek world where political conflicts regularly resulted in the banishment of losing factions, nevertheless marked a profound disruption in an individual's life. To be cut off from one's native city meant the loss of citizenship rights, property, and the web of family and social relationships that defined one's identity and provided security. An exile became a wanderer, dependent on the hospitality of strangers and the willingness of other cities to grant temporary residence. The shame of exile, particularly when associated with accusations of dishonesty or criminal conduct, followed a person across distances, requiring them to establish themselves anew in circumstances far less favorable than those they had previously enjoyed. Diogenes traveled south, eventually making his way to Athens, the city that attracted philosophers, artists, and ambitious individuals from throughout the Greek world. His arrival in Athens likely occurred in his early 20s, at a time when the city had recently concluded the Peloponnesian War in defeat, suffering the dismantling of its naval empire and the temporary abolition of its democratic government. The Spartan victory had brought hardship and humiliation, yet Athens retained its cultural prestige and continued to function as a magnet for intellectual activity. The period following the restoration of democracy saw political trials and executions, most notably that of Socrates in 399 BCE, which sent reverberations through the philosophical community and raised urgent questions about the relationship between the pursuit of wisdom and the demands of civic loyalty. The young exile from Sinope sought instruction from Antisthenes, who maintained a following despite lacking the institutional structure and aristocratic backing that supported Plato's academy. Antisthenes taught in the Cynosarges, a gymnasium located outside the city walls that traditionally served those of mixed parentage who could not claim full Athenian citizenship. His choice of venue reflected his philosophical commitments, as he rejected the pretensions of those who valued birth and social distinction above virtue and self-sufficiency. The approach to philosophy that Antisthenes advocated emphasized practical ethics over theoretical speculation, arguing that virtue consisted in actions rather than in knowledge of abstract forms or principles. The teachings of Antisthenes built upon certain elements of Socratic philosophy while rejecting others, particularly the elaborate metaphysical theories that Plato was developing to explain the relationship between the material world and eternal forms. Antisthenes maintained that only individual things existed, dismissing universal categories as mere linguistic constructions without independent reality. This nominalist position carried implications for ethics, suggesting that virtue could not be taught through theoretical instruction, but had to be practiced and embodied in one's way of life. The reduction of needs, the endurance of hardship, and the cultivation of self-control formed the core of his practical program, which aimed at achieving a state of self-sufficiency that would render a person independent of fortune's fluctuations. Diogenes absorbed these teachings and began to develop his own distinctive approach to philosophy, one that would push the principles articulated by Antisthenes to more radical conclusions, where Antisthenes had criticized conventional values while maintaining a relatively conventional lifestyle. Diogenes chose to demonstrate his philosophical commitments through dramatic public actions that deliberately violated social norms. The decision to adopt an extremely ascetic way of life, reducing his possessions to the bare minimum and rejecting the comforts that most people considered necessary for a decent existence, served as a living argument against the conventional equation of happiness with material prosperity and social status. The stories that accumulated around Diogenes in later centuries, many of them likely embellished or invented to illustrate particular points, nevertheless convey something of the radical nature of his philosophical practice. He was said to have taken up residence in a large ceramic jar or tub of the sort used for storing grain or wine, making his home in a public space rather than maintaining a private household. This choice eliminated the need to earn money for rent and freed him from the domestic responsibilities that structured the lives of ordinary citizens. By making his poverty visible and permanent, he challenged the assumption that a person without property and social standing deserved only pity or contempt. The daily routine that Diogenes established for himself differed fundamentally from the patterns followed by those who participated in conventional society. He rose with the sun, requiring no elaborate preparations or breakfast, and spent his days in public spaces where he could observe his fellow citizens and engage them in conversation or demonstration. The agora, with its constant flow of people conducting business, meeting friends, and discussing current events, provided an ideal setting for the kind of public philosophy he practiced. Unlike teachers who charged fees and delivered formal lectures, He offered his insights freely to anyone willing to listen, though his method of delivery often involved mockery and provocation rather than patient explanation. The physical exercises that occupied his mornings served multiple purposes beyond maintaining bodily health and strength. By training his body to endure cold water baths in winter and to tolerate the heat of summer sun without seeking shade, he developed the capacity to remain indifferent to physical discomfort that would drive most people to seek relief. The practice of walking barefoot on rough ground toughened his feet and eliminated the need for sandals, reducing his dependence on manufactured goods. These exercises in endurance were not undertaken for their own sake, but as training in the mental discipline that allowed him to maintain his philosophical commitments regardless of circumstances. Each successful endurance of hardship reinforced the lesson that comfort was unnecessary and that the body could adapt to conditions that initially seemed unbearable. The observation of daily life in the agora provided endless material for philosophical reflection and intervention. The merchants, haggling over prices, demonstrated the grip that the desire for profit maintained over human behavior, leading people to deceive one another and to value silver more highly than honesty. The politicians delivering speeches revealed the emptiness of rhetoric divorced from genuine wisdom, using elaborate language to persuade audiences while offering nothing of substance. The wealthy citizens, surrounded by slaves and carrying themselves with the pride of their possessions, illustrated the delusion that external goods could confer dignity or worth. Each scene enacted the confusion about value that kept people enslaved to pointless pursuits, providing opportunities for the kind of corrective demonstrations that characterized Diogenes's philosophical practice. The method of teaching through demonstration rather than argument reflected a fundamental conviction about how philosophical transformation occurred. Rational persuasion alone could not overcome the force of habit and the psychological investment people had in their existing values and ways of life. Seeing someone actually live according to different principles, actually flourishing without the things that most people considered necessary, provided evidence more powerful than any theoretical argument could supply. The visible presence of an alternative way of life challenged the supposed necessity of conventional arrangements and opened the possibility that things could be otherwise. The shock value of his provocative actions served to arrest attention and to create moments of reflection that mere words might not achieve. The conversations that Diogenes conducted with those who approached him or whom he accosted combined elements of Socratic questioning with a more aggressive challenging of assumptions. He might ask why someone valued wealth or reputation, pursuing the question until it became clear that the person had no good answer beyond custom or the desire to conform to social expectations. He might point out contradictions between what people claimed to value and how they actually spent their time and resources. The brief exchanges rarely developed into extended philosophical dialogues of the sort Socrates had engaged in, functioning more as interventions designed to plant seeds of doubt than as systematic examinations of concepts. The cumulative effect of many such encounters, witnessed by crowds that gathered around him, created a constant background noise of questioning that challenged the self-satisfaction of Athenian public life. The poverty that defined his material existence extended to his intellectual possessions as well, in the sense that he made no attempt to develop comprehensive theories or to establish systematic doctrines that students could memorize and transmit. Philosophy, in his practice, consisted not in the accumulation of knowledge, but in the cultivation of a certain stance toward life, a manner of being in the world that required constant vigilance and practice, rather than theoretical understanding. The absence of written works meant that his teaching could not be commodified or converted into an academic subject, remaining instead a matter of personal example and direct interaction. The refusal to systematize or to create institutional structures for the transmission of his philosophy ensured that cynicism would remain a radical alternative rather than becoming another established school competing for students and prestige. The material conditions of his existence, which included sleeping in public spaces exposed to weather and the gaze of passers-by, served as a constant advertisement for the philosophical life he advocated. The ceramic storage jar that allegedly served as his shelter provided minimal protection from the elements while making his poverty and his choice of an unconventional dwelling impossible to ignore. The visibility of his living arrangements meant that he could not maintain the separation between public and private life that characterized normal existence, presenting himself continuously as a public figure whose every action could be observed and judged. This exposure to constant scrutiny functioned as a form of philosophical discipline, eliminating the possibility of hypocrisy or inconsistency between his teachings and his private behavior. The rejection of conventional hygiene and grooming standards that characterized his physical presentation carried philosophical significance beyond mere provocation or indifference to appearance. The elaborate bathing rituals and the attention to hair and clothing that marked civilized Greeks as distinct from barbarians represented a form of slavery to social opinion, requiring time, effort, and resources that could be better spent or simply not spent at all. The naturalness of the unwashed and unkempt body contrasted with the artificiality of cultivated appearance, suggesting that civilization's beautification practices reflected vanity rather than any genuine improvement of the human condition. The willingness to appear filthy and degraded challenged the equation of worth with presentation, asserting that virtue resided in character rather than in superficial qualities that impressed others. The encounters with animals that frequented the agora and other public spaces provided object lessons in the kind of existence Diogenes advocated. Dogs, in particular, demonstrated admirable qualities that humans would do well to emulate. They were discriminating in their affections, showing loyalty to those who treated them well while remaining indifferent to those who did not. They lived in the present without anxiety about the future or regret about the past. They performed natural functions without shame or concern for the opinions of observers. They made do with whatever food was available rather than developing elaborate preferences. The comparison to dogs, while initially insulting according to Greek cultural values, became in Diogenes' hands a source of philosophical insight, suggesting that humans had much to learn from creatures they regarded as inferior. The practice of masturbating in public, which several ancient sources attribute to him, represented perhaps the most extreme violation of Greek sexual norms, and the most radical assertion of his principle that natural acts required no concealment. The relegation of sexuality to the private sphere, governed by elaborate rules about appropriate partners and circumstances, reflected in his view an arbitrary restriction that served only to complicate life and to create opportunities for shame and judgment. If hunger could be satisfied in public by eating, then sexual appetite should similarly be relieved openly, without the need for elaborate courtship rituals or private spaces. The philosophical point transcended the particular act, asserting the right to satisfy natural needs without regard for the artificial constraints that society imposed. The question of whether such extreme violations of decorum served any purpose beyond shock or whether they represented essential elements of Cynic philosophy divided those who encountered his teachings. Some saw in them necessary demonstrations of the principle that convention had no binding force and that shame was merely a social construct without natural foundation. Others regarded them as excessive and counterproductive, likely to repel potential followers rather than to attract them to philosophical practice. The tension between the need to challenge conventions dramatically enough to break their psychological hold and the risk of alienating audiences through offensive behavior remained inherent in the project of using provocation as a philosophical method. The economic arrangements through which Diogenes sustained himself without engaging in productive labor or accumulating property demonstrated the possibility of existing at the margins of conventional economic life. Begging provided a regular source of food and occasionally other necessities, while the simplicity of his needs meant that small amounts sufficed for his survival. The willingness of some Athenians to give him food or money despite, or perhaps because of his provocative behavior, suggested that his philosophical performance had value to them, even if they did not choose to imitate his lifestyle. The economic relationship between the philosopher who owned nothing and the citizens who supported him through sporadic gifts created a kind of mutual dependence that neither party would have described in those terms, but that nevertheless structured their interactions. The students who attached themselves to Diogenes and who attempted to practice the Cynic philosophy under his guidance faced the challenge of distinguishing between essential elements of the practice and contingent features of his particular personality and circumstances. The reduction of needs, the cultivation of endurance, and the questioning of conventional values could be pursued at various levels of intensity and with various degrees of public visibility. Some followers adopted extreme poverty and provocative behavior similar to his own, while others maintained more conventional lifestyles while attempting to internalize the philosophical principles he taught. The diversity of approaches among those who identified as cynics reflected the tension between the radical demands of the philosophy and the practical constraints that made complete abandonment of social life difficult for most people. The relationship between self-sufficiency and community presented a recurring challenge for a philosophy that valorized independence while acknowledging human social nature. Diogenes depended on the community for his survival through begging and through the tolerance that allowed him to continue his activities without arrest or expulsion. His philosophical practice required an audience to observe his demonstrations and to engage in the conversations through which he disseminated his ideas. The ideal of complete self-sufficiency remained more aspiration than achievement, given the inescapable human need for at least minimal interaction with others. The recognition of this dependency did not undermine the philosophical point, which concerned psychological freedom rather than absolute material independence, but it did complicate the presentation of self-sufficiency as an achievable goal. The philosophical activity of Diogenes took forms that pushed against the boundaries of acceptable public behavior while remaining just within the limits of what the Athenians would tolerate. He walked through the marketplace in broad daylight, carrying a lighted lamp, claiming to be searching for an honest man, a gesture that simultaneously mocked the pretensions of his fellow citizens and enacted his belief that true virtue was exceedingly rare. When he saw a child drinking water from cupped hands, he threw away his own cup, recognizing that even this simple possession was unnecessary for meeting basic needs. These actions served as object lessons in the principles he advocated, demonstrating through example rather than argument the possibility of living with radical simplicity. The physical appearance that Diogenes cultivated reinforced his rejection of conventional standards of respectability and decorum. He wore a single rough cloak that served as both garment and blanket, never changing it or washing it according to some accounts. His hair and beard grew wild and unkempt, presenting a stark contrast to the groomed appearance expected of citizens who valued their reputation. By deliberately making himself filthy and unkempt, he removed himself from the competition for status and admiration that drove so much social behavior, demonstrating his indifference to the opinions of others. This indifference extended to basic bodily functions, which he reportedly performed in public without shame, arguing that if an activity was natural, there could be no reason to hide it. The concept of shamelessness, which became central to the Cynic philosophy associated with Diogenes, derived from a radical interpretation of what it meant to live in accordance with nature. The conventions that governed Greek social life, including those concerning nudity, sexuality, and bodily functions, represented, in his view, arbitrary restrictions that had no foundation in nature itself. Animals performed these functions openly without moral consequence, and the addition of human self-consciousness did not transform morally neutral acts into shameful ones. By violating taboos surrounding these matters, Diogenes sought to expose the arbitrary character of social conventions and to liberate people from the tyranny of concern for reputation. The marketplace conversations in which Diogenes engaged often took the form of brief exchanges that exposed contradictions in conventional thinking or challenged unexamined assumptions about value and virtue. When someone praised wealth, he might point to a beggar and ask whether the rich man was happier. When told that a certain activity was impossible or degrading, he would perform it immediately to demonstrate otherwise. These interventions functioned as a kind of street theater, using shock and humor to make philosophical points more effectively than formal arguments might have done. The crowd that gathered around him included both admirers who recognized the force of his critiques and detractors who found his behavior offensive and his philosophy destructive of civilized life. The relationship between Diogenes and Plato, who represented in many ways the opposite pole of Greek philosophy, generated numerous anecdotes that illustrated their fundamental disagreements about the nature of philosophy and the path to wisdom. Where Plato sought eternal truths through rational contemplation and the construction of systematic theories, Diogenes insisted that philosophy must be lived rather than merely thought. When Plato defined a human being as a featherless biped, Diogenes reportedly plucked a chicken and brought it to Plato's school, announcing that he had found Plato's human, forcing Plato to add "with broad, flat nails" to his definition. The story, whether historical or invented, captured the essence of Diogenes's critique of abstract theorizing divorced from concrete reality. The contempt that Diogenes expressed for theoretical philosophy extended beyond Plato to encompass the entire enterprise of systematic thought that characterized the major philosophical schools. He saw little value in elaborate arguments about the nature of being, the structure of the cosmos, or the foundations of knowledge, regarding these inquiries as distractions from the practical task of learning to live well. The good life, in his view, required no theoretical preparation, but only the courage to break with convention and the discipline to maintain independence from desires that enslaved most people to pursuits that brought no lasting satisfaction. Any person, regardless of education or social standing, could in principle achieve the self-sufficiency and freedom that constituted human flourishing. The training that Diogenes prescribed for those who would follow his path involved the deliberate cultivation of hardship and the systematic reduction of needs. He recommended exercising in summer heat and winter cold, sleeping on the ground, eating simple foods, and rejecting the pleasures that most people pursued as the highest goods. This regimen served not as an end in itself, but as a means of achieving freedom from dependence on external circumstances, by demonstrating to oneself that comfort was unnecessary, that pain could be endured, and that social approval meant nothing. A person could achieve a state of independence that rendered them invulnerable to the changes of fortune that terrified and motivated most people. The wealthy person who lost their fortune faced ruin, but one who had never possessed anything lost nothing when circumstances changed. The Athenians, who observed Diogenes' behavior and heard his pronouncements, responded with a mixture of amusement, admiration, and hostility. Some saw in him a kind of holy fool who spoke truths that others lacked the courage to voice, while others regarded him as a public nuisance whose deliberate violations of decorum deserved punishment or expulsion. The fact that he was allowed to continue his activities for decades suggests that his transgressions remained within bounds that Athenian society could tolerate despite their provocative character. Perhaps his status as an exile without property or political ambitions made him seem less threatening than he might otherwise have been, or perhaps his poverty and evident self-denial earned him a degree of respect even from those who rejected his philosophy. The wanderings that characterized Diogenes' life extended beyond Athens to other Greek cities where he would spend extended periods before returning to his adopted home. The city of Corinth, located on the isthmus connecting the Peloponnese to mainland Greece, became another important site for his philosophical activity. Corinth's position as a major commercial center made it wealthy and cosmopolitan, attracting merchants and travelers from across the Mediterranean world. The contrast between the city's prosperity and luxury and Diogenes' austere lifestyle would have been even more pronounced than in Athens, providing additional opportunities for the kind of provocative demonstrations he favored. The philosophical reputation that Diogenes acquired during his years of public teaching and demonstration spread through the network of Greek cities, carried by travelers who had witnessed his performances or heard accounts of his sayings and actions. The stories that circulated about him tended to emphasize the most shocking and memorable incidents, creating a public image that combined philosophical wisdom with outrageous behavior. This reputation attracted both admirers who sought him out for instruction and critics who regarded him as a dangerous influence whose teachings undermined the foundations of civilized life. The controversy surrounding him ensured that his name remained known even in cities he had never visited, spreading awareness of Cynic philosophy beyond the circle of those who had direct contact with him. The athletic competitions and religious festivals that brought people together from throughout the Greek world provided settings where Diogenes could address large audiences and demonstrate his philosophy to crowds that included visitors from distant cities. The Olympic Games, the Isthmian Games held near Corinth, and other pan-Hellenic gatherings attracted tens of thousands of spectators who came to watch athletic contests, attend sacrifices, and participate in the cultural events that accompanied the competitions. The presence of sophists, poets, and other performers who used these occasions to display their talents and attract students created an atmosphere in which philosophical demonstrations could find receptive audiences. The temporary nature of these gatherings suited Diogenes' itinerant lifestyle, allowing him to make an impression on people who would then carry accounts of his teaching back to their home cities. The contrast between the elaborate preparations that athletes underwent to compete in the games and the simple exercises that constituted Diogenes' physical training provided material for pointed commentary on the relationship between effort and value. The runners and wrestlers who devoted years to perfecting their skills and who endured rigorous training. Regimens did so in pursuit of prizes that consisted of olive crowns or pine wreaths, honors that brought prestige but no lasting benefit. The self-discipline and endurance they cultivated served ultimately to achieve victories that mattered, only within the artificial framework of competitive sport. Diogenes' own training in hardship and self-control aimed at a different kind of victory, one that consisted in freedom from the desires that motivated athletes and that could be achieved without public recognition or external validation. The religious aspect of the major festivals, which involved elaborate sacrifices and processions honoring the gods, provided another target for Cynic criticism of conventional piety and ritual observance. The vast expenditure of resources on animal sacrifices, temple dedications, and priestly functions served in Diogenes's view to support a parasitic class while contributing nothing to genuine religious understanding or virtue. The gods, if they existed and concerned themselves with human affairs, would care more about how people lived than about the number of oxen burned in their honor. The identification of piety with ritual correctness and generous offerings represented a corruption of religion that allowed people to imagine they could purchase divine favor while continuing to behave unjustly toward their fellow humans. The sophists and rhetoricians who delivered public speeches at the festivals, displaying their eloquence and competing for students willing to pay substantial fees, embodied everything that Diogenes rejected in contemporary education. The emphasis on persuasive speech rather than truth, on winning arguments rather than seeking wisdom, on professional success rather than ethical transformation, had turned philosophy into a commodity sold to the highest bidder. The young men who sought instruction in rhetoric learned how to make the weaker argument appear stronger, how to manipulate audiences through appeals to emotion, and how to advance their own interests through verbal skill. These arts, however impressive their technical mastery, contributed nothing to genuine human flourishing and arguably undermined it by encouraging the pursuit of victory over opponents rather than collaborative search for truth. The development of Diogenes's philosophical persona over years of public activity involved a continuous refinement of methods and messages that proved most effective in challenging conventional assumptions and provoking reflection. The repertoire of provocative acts and memorable sayings grew through experimentation and repetition, with successful demonstrations being repeated and unsuccessful ones abandoned. The lamp carried through the marketplace in daylight searching for an honest man became a signature performance, instantly recognizable and endlessly interpretable. The act of throwing away his cup after seeing a child drink from hands demonstrated the principle of reducing needs through a single vivid gesture that required no verbal explanation. The accumulation of such performances created a philosophical practice that operated through accumulated examples rather than through systematic argument. The intellectual exchanges with other philosophers of his era, while often antagonistic, contributed to the clarification of what distinguished Cynic philosophy from the approaches developed by the major schools. The debates with Plato and his students about the nature of universals, the possibility of knowledge, and the relationship between the ideal and the actual revealed fundamental differences in philosophical method and ambition. Where Plato sought eternal truths accessible only through rational contemplation and mathematical reasoning, Diogenes insisted that philosophy concerned practical questions about how to live and required no special education or intellectual gifts. The accessibility of Cynic philosophy to anyone willing to embrace its demanding practices contrasted sharply with the elitism of Platonic philosophy, which presupposed years of mathematical training as preparation for grasping the highest truths. The criticism that Diogenes directed at Aristotle, who had been Plato's most distinguished student and who established his own school in Athens, focused on the gulf between theoretical knowledge and practical wisdom. Aristotle's vast learning, his detailed investigations of natural phenomena, his systematic classifications of plant and animal species, his logical analyses of argument forms, all of this demonstrated impressive intellectual achievement while remaining largely irrelevant to the fundamental human question of how to achieve happiness. The philosopher who could discourse learnedly about the motions of celestial bodies or the constitutions of Greek city-states might nevertheless live badly, enslaved to desires for honor or wealth that no amount of theoretical knowledge could overcome. The priority of practical ethics over theoretical inquiry that characterized Cynicism represented a rejection of the Aristotelian project of comprehensive knowledge in favor of focused attention to the conduct of life. The relationship between Diogenes and the comic poets of Athens, who made him a character in their plays and used him to satirize various targets, reflected the complex status he occupied in Athenian cultural life. The appearance of Cynic philosophers on the comic stage alongside politicians, sophists, and other recognizable types indicated that they had become sufficiently prominent and distinctive to serve as objects of public humor. The comic treatment could be affectionate or hostile depending on the playwright's purposes, but in either case it testified to the cultural visibility that Diogenes and his followers had achieved. The laughter that greeted comic representations of their behavior served both to reinforce social norms that they violated and to acknowledge the force of their challenge to those norms. The practical advice that Diogenes offered to those who consulted him about how to live combined specific recommendations about reducing needs with more general principles about maintaining independence from external circumstances. The student who complained about poverty would be told to observe how little was actually necessary for survival and how much of what people called poverty was merely the absence of luxuries. The person troubled by insults or slights would be reminded that words could harm only if one granted them power through caring about the opinions of others. The individual seeking guidance about career choices would be questioned about whether the proposed path served genuine needs or merely social ambitions. The cumulative effect of such consultations was to redirect attention away from external achievements and toward the cultivation of inner resources that could provide security against fortune's changes. The demonstrations of philosophical principles through action often took forms that deliberately shocked observers into reconsidering assumptions they had never questioned. When invited to a lavish dinner party, he might arrive carrying a knapsack and proceed to beg from the wealthy guests, illustrating that their abundance created no obligation on his part to defer to their status or to moderate his habitual practices. When told that a certain action was impossible or unthinkable, he would perform it immediately, showing that social impossibility differed from natural impossibility and that the unthinkable could be thought and done. The theatrical quality of these interventions served pedagogical purposes, creating memorable images that would circulate through conversation and continue to provoke reflection long after the original performance. Among the stories associated with Diogenes' time in Corinth, the most famous involves his encounter with Alexander the Great, who visited the city in 336 BCE following his accession to the Macedonian throne. Alexander, having heard of the philosopher's reputation, sought him out and found him lying in the sun. When the young king asked if there was anything he could do for him, Diogenes replied that Alexander could stand aside and stop blocking the sunlight. The response, which treated the most powerful man in the Greek world as nothing more than an obstruction to a free good, encapsulated Diogenes' indifference to worldly power and his conviction that self-sufficiency constituted the only true kingship. Alexander reportedly remarked that if he were not Alexander, he would wish to be Diogenes, recognizing perhaps that the philosopher possessed a freedom that even unlimited power could not provide. The philosophical position that found expression in such encounters rested on a fundamental reordering of values that reversed conventional hierarchies of worth. What most people pursued as goods, wealth, power, fame, pleasure, appeared to Diogenes as sources of slavery rather than freedom, binding people to pursuits that could never fully satisfy and that left them vulnerable to loss and disappointment. The truly valuable things, including virtue, self-knowledge, and independence, required no external resources and remained secure against the vicissitudes of fortune. A person who had internalized this understanding and organized their life accordingly achieved a kind of invulnerability, needing nothing from the world and therefore fearing nothing it might take away. The teachings of Diogenes on specific ethical questions flowed from these fundamental commitments and generally took the form of rejecting conventional moral distinctions as arbitrary or confused. The elaborate systems of etiquette that governed social interaction served only to maintain hierarchies and to allow people to judge and exclude one another. The taboos surrounding certain foods or behaviors had no basis in nature and functioned only to complicate life unnecessarily. The institution of private property, while he did not advocate its abolition in any programmatic sense, reflected a kind of collective delusion about what belonged to whom, since nature had provided common resources that human convention had divided and restricted. The family, organized around marriage and bloodlines, represented another artificial construction that interfered with the natural affection that could exist among all human beings. The practice of begging, which Diogenes apparently engaged in regularly to obtain food and other necessities, carried philosophical significance beyond mere economic necessity. In asking for what he needed from those who had more than they needed, he enacted a relationship of mutual dependence that challenged the pride of benefactors who imagined themselves as superior to those they helped. The act of accepting charity without gratitude or deference frustrated the expectations of those who gave in order to establish obligations or to enjoy the satisfaction of superior virtue. By treating their gifts as nothing more than the return of what nature had made common to all, he refused to participate in the economy of reciprocity and status that structured most social relations. The animals that lived in and around Greek cities provided models for the kind of existence Diogenes advocated, living according to their nature without shame or pretension. Dogs, in particular, which roamed freely and performed their bodily functions in public view, became emblematic of the philosophical approach he represented. The term cynic, derived from the Greek word for dog, appears to have been applied to him and his followers either as an insult that they then embraced or as a self-designation that acknowledged their dog-like shamelessness and freedom from conventional constraints. The comparison to dogs carried both positive and negative connotations, suggesting on one hand a kind of natural wisdom and self-sufficiency, and on the other a degraded status outside civilized society. The students and followers who gathered around Diogenes over the years absorbed his teachings and attempted to practice the kind of life he exemplified, though the extent to which they matched his extremism varied considerably. Some adopted his poverty and his provocative public behavior, while others accepted his critique of conventional values while maintaining more conventional lifestyles. The lack of any formal institutional structure meant that cynicism as a philosophical movement remained loose and decentralized, defined more by shared commitments and practices than by adherence to specific doctrines. The transmission of the philosophy occurred primarily through example and through the memorable sayings and actions that could be recounted and imitated. The travels that took Diogenes to various Greek cities may have included a journey by sea that resulted in his capture by pirates and his subsequent sale into slavery. The historicity of this episode remains uncertain, but the stories associated with it reflect themes central to his philosophy. When asked what he could do, he reportedly replied that he knew how to govern men, and should therefore be sold to someone in need of a master. This, Reversal of the expected relationship between slave and master embodied his conviction that true mastery consisted in self-control rather than in the exercise of power over others. The person who commanded their own desires ruled themselves more effectively than any tyrant ruled a city. The household in Corinth, where Diogenes allegedly spent time as a slave, belonged to a man named Xeniades, who recognized the philosopher's wisdom and treated him more as a tutor for his children than as a piece of property. The arrangement, if it occurred, would have provided Diogenes with a kind of security while maintaining his fundamental independence from conventional social structures. Whether legally free or enslaved, his inner freedom remained unchanged, demonstrating the sufficiency of virtue to secure happiness regardless of external circumstances. The story functioned as an illustration of the principle that philosophical training could render a person invulnerable to fortune's reversals. The daily schedule that Diogenes maintained in his later years, whether in Athens or Corinth, continued to center on public spaces and interactions with whoever encountered him. The mornings might be spent in physical exercise, running or performing movements designed to maintain strength and flexibility despite advancing age. The afternoons saw him in the agora or other gathering places, engaging passers-by in conversation or simply observing the human comedy of ambition, vanity, and self-deception that played out around him. The evenings required little by way of preparation for rest, since he owned no furniture and needed no elaborate bedtime routine. The meals that sustained him came from whatever sources presented themselves, whether from begging, from the hospitality of admirers, or from what could be gathered or found. The diet consisted of basic items that required no preparation: bread, olives, whatever vegetables or fruits were available, consumed with no attention to pleasure or variety. The discipline of eating only to satisfy hunger rather than for enjoyment represented a daily practice of the self-control that constituted virtue in his understanding. By reducing eating to its functional minimum, he freed himself from the slavery to appetite that drove people to spend their lives pursuing ever more elaborate pleasures. The relationships that Diogenes maintained with other philosophers of his era appear to have been largely antagonistic, or at least mutually uncomprehending. The emphasis on theoretical knowledge and systematic argumentation that characterized the major schools found no echo in his practice of philosophy as a way of life demonstrated through action. The students of Plato and later of Aristotle, who filled their days with lectures, discussions, and the composition of treatises on logic, ethics, and physics, pursued goals that seemed to him entirely beside the point of philosophy. The accumulation of knowledge about nature or the development of complex ethical theories contributed nothing to the practical task of learning to live well. The public lectures and demonstrations that earned other philosophers substantial fees and enabled them to support themselves in comfort illustrated the corruption of philosophy by economic motives. To accept payment for teaching implied that wisdom could be bought and sold like any other commodity, reducing it to a mere skill or technique rather than a transformation of the soul. The true philosopher needed no payment because they needed nothing at all, having achieved the self-sufficiency that constituted the goal of philosophy. The willingness to teach without fee removed any incentive for flattering students or adapting instruction to meet their preferences rather than their actual needs. The political developments of the period that saw the rise of Macedonian power and the conquest of the Persian Empire by Alexander generated little apparent concern or commentary from Diogenes. The expansion of Greek political and military domination across vast territories, the establishment of new cities, and the transformation of the balance of power meant little to one who regarded all political arrangements as equally artificial and equally irrelevant to human flourishing. Whether Athens remained independent or fell under Macedonian control, whether democracies or oligarchies governed the cities, the fundamental task of achieving virtue through self-sufficiency remained unchanged. The cosmopolitan perspective that would later be articulated by Stoic philosophers, who drew on Cynic ideas while developing them in more systematic directions, had its roots in this indifference to the particular political community to which one belonged. The question of family and procreation presented particular challenges for a philosophy that rejected conventional social institutions while recognizing the natural human need for companionship and continuity. Diogenes appears to have advocated a kind of communal arrangement in which children would be raised collectively rather than within nuclear families, and in which sexual relationships would be freed from the constraints of marriage and property transmission. The practical implementation of such arrangements remained unclear, and nothing in the historical record suggests that he established communities organized along these lines. The proposals functioned more as provocations than as serious social programs designed to expose the arbitrary character of existing institutions. The advancing years brought physical changes that even the most rigorous philosophical discipline could not entirely overcome. The strength and endurance that had allowed him to sleep outdoors in all weather and to sustain himself on minimal food gradually diminished. The ability to perform the physical demonstrations that had been part of his philosophical practice became more difficult. Yet the core of his teaching, which emphasized mental independence rather than physical prowess, remained available to him and to those who had learned from his example. The self-sufficiency that constituted virtue did not depend on bodily strength, but on the discipline of desire and the freedom from false beliefs about what mattered for happiness. The routines of his final years maintained continuity with the patterns established decades earlier, though the range of his activities necessarily contracted. The same public spaces continued to serve as his dwelling place and his classroom. The same simple diet sustained him, and the same philosophical commitments guided his interactions with others. The accumulation of years had made him a familiar figure to generations of Athenians and Corinthians, some of whom had grown up hearing stories about his exploits and provocations. The young men who sought him out now encountered an elderly philosopher whose way of life had remained consistent across decades, providing evidence that the radical independence he advocated was sustainable over a complete human lifespan. The anecdotes that clustered around his later years tended to emphasize his consistency and his continued commitment to living in accordance with the principles he taught. When asked why he begged from a statue, he replied that he was practicing being refused, illustrating the importance of preparing oneself mentally for rejection and disappointment. When someone observed that he was growing old, he agreed, but noted that he would not give up a wrestling match simply because he was approaching the final round. These responses demonstrated the philosophical attitude toward aging and death, which regarded them as natural processes requiring acceptance rather than fear or denial. The circumstances of his death in Corinth around 323 BCE generated various accounts that reflected the symbolic significance later generations found in his life and teaching. One version held that he died from eating a raw octopus, deliberately consuming something that proved poisonous in an act that combined his disregard for conventional food preparation with a kind of philosophical suicide. Another account suggested that he died from holding his breath, exercising ultimate control over his own life by choosing its end. A third version simply reported that he died from old age, his body finally giving out after decades of exposure and deprivation. The multiplicity of accounts mattered less than what they revealed about the understanding of his death as a final demonstration of philosophical principles. The burial of a person without property or family presented practical challenges that were resolved through the intervention of admirers who ensured that he received proper funeral rites. The competition among those who claimed the honor of burying him reflected the respect that his way of life had earned despite its radical rejection of conventional values. The memorial erected in Corinth featured a column topped with a dog carved in marble, acknowledging the Cynic identity he had made his own. The inscription praised him for showing mortals the path to self-sufficiency, suggesting that his contemporaries recognized the significance of his philosophical contribution, even when they could not or would not follow his example. The immediate aftermath of his death saw the continuation of Cynic philosophy through students and followers who had absorbed his teachings and attempted to live according to his principles. Crates of Thebes, who had given away his considerable wealth to embrace poverty and philosophical practice, became the most prominent representative of Cynicism in the generation following Diogenes. The example of a wealthy man voluntarily choosing the life of a beggar philosopher demonstrated that cynicism appealed not only to those who had nothing to lose, but also to those who could compare the satisfactions of conventional success with the freedom of philosophical independence. The movement remained small and marginal, never achieving the institutional stability or intellectual prestige of the academy or the lyceum, but it persisted as a living tradition of philosophical radicalism. The broader philosophical landscape of the Hellenistic period that followed the death of Alexander the Great saw the emergence of new schools that drew selectively on Cynic ideas while rejecting their most extreme conclusions. The Stoics, who established their school in Athens in the early 3rd century BCE, adopted the Cynic emphasis on virtue as the sole good and the importance of living in accordance with nature. But they developed these ideas within a systematic framework that included logic, physics, and a more positive engagement with social and political life. The transformation of Cynic insights into a respectable philosophical system that attracted adherents from the educated elite represented both a validation of Diogenes' fundamental critique of conventional values and a domestication of his radical challenge to civilized norms. The written accounts of Diogenes' life and teachings that began to appear in the centuries following his death served various purposes for different audiences. Some preserved or invented anecdotes that illustrated particular philosophical points, using the memorable figure of the Cynic philosopher to make abstract principles concrete and vivid. Others attempted to systematize Cynic teaching into a coherent doctrine despite the lack of written works by Diogenes himself. Still others used his example as a foil against which to define alternative philosophical approaches, presenting him as a kind of reductio ad absurdum of the Socratic emphasis on virtue and self-knowledge. The multiplication of stories and interpretations gradually transformed the historical person into a literary and philosophical character whose significance transcended the particularities of his actual life. The Roman period saw renewed interest in cynicism as a philosophical option for those disaffected by the materialism and corruption they perceived in their society. Philosophers who adopted the Cynic lifestyle wandered the cities of the empire, delivering speeches that criticized luxury and moral decline while demonstrating through their own poverty and simplicity the possibility of living differently. The emperors and provincial governors who encountered these figures responded with varying degrees of tolerance, sometimes respecting their freedom of speech and sometimes expelling them as threats to public order. The tension between Cynic claims to speak truth to power and the requirements of political stability replayed in a Roman context the dynamics that had characterized Diogenes' relationship with the Athenians. The place of Diogenes within the history of philosophy remained contested through subsequent centuries, with some regarding him as a crucial figure who embodied the practical dimension of Socratic teaching, while others dismissed him as a charlatan whose provocations contributed nothing of lasting value. The absence of written works that could be studied and interpreted meant that his philosophical legacy depended entirely on the stories transmitted about his life and sayings. The process of transmission inevitably involved selection, embellishment, and invention, making it difficult to separate the historical person from the accumulation of legend. Yet the basic outlines of his approach to philosophy, the emphasis on practice over theory, the critique of conventional values, the ideal of self-sufficiency, remained recognizable across different accounts. The medieval period saw little direct engagement with Cynic philosophy, as Christian thinkers found the emphasis on shamelessness and the rejection of social institutions incompatible with religious teaching about modesty and the divinely ordained character of hierarchies. Some elements of Cynicism, particularly the valorization of poverty and the critique of wealth, found echoes in monastic movements and in the teachings of radical religious reformers, but these similarities operated within a framework of divine commands and ultimate accountability that was foreign to the naturalistic ethics of Diogenes. The stories about him survived primarily as examples of pagan philosophy that Christianity had superseded, rather than as living options for how to organize one's life. The revival of interest in classical philosophy during the Renaissance brought renewed attention to Cynic ideas, though again primarily as objects of historical interest rather than as serious philosophical alternatives. The humanist scholars who edited and translated the ancient sources that preserved accounts of Diogenes's life and teaching were attracted by his wit and his defiance of authority, but few were prepared to embrace the radical simplicity and social alienation his philosophy demanded. The emerging commercial civilization of early modern Europe, with its celebration of refinement and its elaborate codes of courtesy, found in Cynicism a reminder of an ancient alternative that served mainly to highlight how far civilization had progressed beyond such primitive conditions. The Enlightenment brought a more sympathetic engagement with Cynic criticism of conventional morality and social institutions, as philosophers who questioned inherited traditions found in Diogenes a precursor to their own projects of rational critique. The emphasis on nature as a standard against which to evaluate social arrangements resonated with the natural law theories that sought to ground ethics and politics in universal principles rather than in particular customs. Yet the Enlightenment project of reconstructing society on rational foundations departed significantly from the Cynic rejection of systematic theory in favor of individual practice. The attempt to derive comprehensive social and political systems from first principles represented precisely the kind of philosophical ambition that Diogenes had mocked. The 19th century saw various appropriations of Cynic ideas by critics of industrial capitalism and bourgeois morality who found in Diogenes's voluntary poverty and his critique of material values a model for alternatives to the dominant economic and social order. The socialist and anarchist movements that challenged existing property relations and power structures sometimes invoked cynicism as a precursor to their own visions of radical social transformation, though the individualistic character of Cynic philosophy sat uneasily with the emphasis on collective organization that characterized most left-wing political movements. The figure of Diogenes served more as a symbol of resistance to oppression and convention than as a source of practical guidance for political action. The 20th century brought renewed philosophical interest in questions about the relationship between theory and practice, the nature of authentic existence, and the critique of modern mass society that resonated with themes in Cynic philosophy. Existentialist thinkers who emphasized individual freedom and the importance of creating meaning through one's choices found in Diogenes an ancient exemplar of radical authenticity. The counterculture movements of the 1960s and 1970s, with their rejection of material success and their experimentation with alternative lifestyles, drew consciously or unconsciously on Cynic ideals of simplicity and self-sufficiency. Yet the differences in historical context and philosophical framework meant that these modern movements transformed Cynicism as much as they preserved it. The scholarly study of ancient philosophy that developed in universities over the past century approached Diogenes and Cynicism with the methods of historical and philological research, attempting to reconstruct as accurately as possible what could be known about the movement from surviving sources. This academic engagement produced detailed analyses of the textual evidence, careful distinctions between reliable accounts and later fabrications, and sophisticated interpretations of how Cynic philosophy related to other ancient schools. The professionalization of philosophy as an academic discipline created an irony, transforming the study of a thinker who had rejected systematic theory and institutional structures into a subject for scholarly monographs and university courses. The enduring fascination with Diogenes across different periods and contexts suggests that the questions he raised about value, freedom, and the good life retain their power to provoke and disturb. The tension between the requirements of civilized life and the claims of individual authenticity, between social obligations and personal independence, between conventional success and inner peace, continues to structure debates about how humans should live together and what they should seek in life. The extreme character of his answers to these questions, including his rejection of nearly all social conventions and his embrace of poverty and shamelessness, marks one possible response that clarifies the stakes and the costs of different approaches without necessarily providing a model that most people could or would want to follow. The legacy of Diogenes within philosophy rests less on specific doctrines or arguments than on the example of a life lived in accordance with principles that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and social organization. The commitment to demonstrating philosophical truths through action rather than defending them through argument, the insistence that true freedom required the elimination of desires rather than their satisfaction, the conviction that conventional values rested on confusion and delusion. These themes continued to echo through subsequent philosophical traditions, even when they were modified or incorporated into very different frameworks. The figure of the Cynic philosopher, wandering without possessions and proclaiming uncomfortable truths, remained available as a point of reference whenever the relationship between philosophy and society came under examination. The question of whether Diogenes achieved the happiness and freedom he claimed remains as difficult to answer as it was for his contemporaries who observed his way of life with a mixture of admiration and skepticism. The absence of direct access to his inner experience means that judgments about the success of his philosophical practice must rely on inference from his persistence in maintaining an extremely demanding lifestyle over many decades. The consistency between his teachings and his actions, the absence of any reported desire to return to conventional life, and the respect he earned even from critics suggest that he found in his chosen path something that satisfied him more than the alternatives. Whether that satisfaction constituted genuine flourishing or merely the absence of the desires that troubled others remains open to interpretation. The physical hardships that characterized his daily existence served purposes beyond mere self-denial, functioning as a form of ongoing philosophical practice that reinforced the lessons he taught. The experience of enduring cold, hunger, and discomfort provided empirical evidence that these conditions were not as terrible as people imagined, and that happiness did not depend on their avoidance. Each day of living without the comforts that most people considered necessary demonstrated the possibility of radical self-sufficiency and challenged the assumptions that kept people enslaved to pursuits they believed essential. The discipline of repeatedly choosing hardship over ease cultivated the strength of will that made genuine freedom possible. The influence that Diogenes exercised on subsequent philosophical developments operated primarily through the transmission of stories and sayings rather than through any institutional continuity or body of written work. The memorable character of his actions and pronouncements made them ideal vehicles for preserving and communicating philosophical insights across generations and cultural boundaries. The anecdotes functioned as compressed arguments that could be grasped immediately without elaborate theoretical preparation, making them accessible to audiences that might lack the education or patience for systematic treatises. The power of example to move and convince proved as important for the survival and impact of his philosophy as any argument could have been. The comparison that ancient sources drew between Diogenes and Socrates, both of whom philosophized in public spaces and challenged their fellow citizens to examine their lives, highlighted both similarities and differences in their approaches. Like Socrates, Diogenes used questioning and provocation to disturb complacency and expose contradictions, but where Socrates sought, through dialogue, to lead interlocutors toward knowledge of the good, Diogenes demonstrated through his own life what living well required. The shift from Socratic questioning to Cynic demonstration represented a transformation in philosophical method that emphasized action over inquiry, practice over theory, and individual transformation over the pursuit of knowledge. The centuries that have passed since his death in Corinth have seen countless reinterpretations of his significance and countless debates about the value and viability of the philosophical approach he represented. The extreme character of his positions has made him a perennially controversial figure, admired by some as a prophet of authentic existence, and dismissed by others as a destructive nihilist who offered no constructive alternative to the values he criticized. The persistence of these debates testifies to the continuing relevance of the fundamental questions he raised about what human beings need to flourish and what price is worth paying for freedom and independence. The image of Diogenes that persisted through the centuries, the beggar philosopher who lived in a barrel and spoke truth to power, captured essential features of his approach while simplifying and dramatizing a more complex reality. The symbolic power of this image derived from its crystallization of the tension between wisdom and worldly success, between inner freedom and external constraint, between nature and convention. Whether the historical person matched this image mattered less for his influence than the fact that the image embodied philosophical possibilities that continued to attract and challenge those who encountered it. The lessons that later generations drew from his example varied according to their own concerns and commitments, with some emphasizing his critique of materialism, others his championing of individual freedom, and still others his demonstration that philosophy must be lived rather than merely studied. The capacity of his life and teaching to support multiple interpretations reflected both the simplicity of his core insights and the radical implications they carried for anyone willing to take them seriously. The invitation to question everything, to need nothing, and to live according to nature rather than convention remained as challenging and as potentially transformative as it had been for those who first encountered him in the streets of Athens and Corinth. The final assessment of Diogenes's contribution to philosophy and to human self-understanding must acknowledge both the power of his critique and the difficulties of his proposed alternative. The exposure of the arbitrary character of many social conventions, the demonstration that happiness does not depend on material prosperity, and the articulation of freedom as self-sufficiency rather than the satisfaction of desires. These insights retain their force even for those who cannot accept the radical asceticism through which he embodied them. The question of how to live well in society while maintaining individual authenticity and independence continues to demand answers that navigate between the extremes of complete conformity and complete withdrawal, between the mindless pursuit of conventional success and the rejection of all social goods. The place that history has assigned to Diogenes reflects this complexity, honoring him as an important figure in the philosophical tradition, while recognizing that few have been willing or able to follow his path completely. The philosophical schools that drew on Cynic ideas transformed them into something more palatable and more socially integrated, preserving the critical edge while blunting the radical challenge to civilized norms. The tension between the respect accorded to his memory and the unwillingness to emulate his practice suggests that his significance lies more in the questions he raised than in the answers he offered, more in the challenge he posed than in any program he advanced. The voice of Diogenes, speaking across the centuries through the stories that preserved his words and deeds, continues to ask whether the lives people lead reflect genuine choices about what matters, or merely the uncritical acceptance of values and goals that serve interests other than their own flourishing. The question admits no single answer valid for all times and places, but the asking of it remains essential to any serious engagement with the problem of how to live. The example of one who asked it radically and lived according to his answer, whatever its limitations, provides a measure against which other answers can be compared, and a reminder that alternatives to the dominant patterns of social life remain possible for those willing to pay the price they demand.